Well, hello again, you wonderful, amazing, beautiful, awesome people. Welcome back to the Unseen. This week we are on Daniel chapter 5. Last week, obviously, we talked into Daniel chapter 4, and that was kind of a second part to, I believe, Daniel chapter 2, which was about dreams. So we talked a little more on dreaming. We just didn't spend as much time on it. But yeah, last week was Daniel chapter 4. This week is Daniel chapter 5. This is a pretty cool one. Specifically because of what happens in it with what goes on in the spirit, what is happening in the spirit realm, that we'll talk about in just a second. But so here we're going to learn what's going on, that these kind of encounters can happen. They can even be normal, with your awareness, especially growing in it. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of introing into how can we grow in favor and authority and in power. That sounds like a lot, and we're not going to hit on all of that right now, but I'm going to kind of lead into that a little. So here there's a whole lot of stuff happening. So let's start Daniel chapter 5. All right, so as I've been doing, I kind of give a little bit of a synopsis, if you will, on the chapter. So here is the first chapter in Daniel where it's not King Nebuchadnezzar anymore. He is now dead, and Daniel is still a part of things in Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar is dead, and this is actually, in Daniel chapter 5, this is his grandson. So his name's Belshazzar. This is his grandson, and it calls him the king. I'm not going to go into that. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. And it opens up on him with kind of like just this partying celebration mode. And it's interesting because he's immediately back to exactly what his grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, was doing, where the whole scene basically opens up on him and all the people with him, his concubines, his wives, and other lords with him. They are specifically using the vessels from the Lord's temple, so all like the holy, the sanctified, the consecrated vessels from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem that King Nebuchadnezzar took when they conquered Jerusalem. They're using all of those things in their drinking and eating and partying, basically. So this is where the scene opens up. He's very haughty, if you will, very prideful, pretty much exalting himself and his greatness and power, and going right back to what was one of the main issues with King Nebuchadnezzar that we've already talked about. So that's where it opens up. And during this time, all of a sudden, so this is where we get into the strange, mystical stuff that happens. During their party, all of a sudden, this hand shows up. Now, we know it's not just a hand. This wasn't like this supernatural, well, it is supernatural, but it's not like just this big floating hand of God that shows up. This was actually, it would have been just a spiritual being. Maybe it was an angel, not sure. Doesn't really say, but it says that it looked like the hand of a man, and it was connected, but there must have been a cutoff point where they just weren't able to see the whole thing. So it wasn't like it was just this disembodied hand floating around like the Addams family, except that was physical. What was that? Was that Cousin It? I can't remember. Thing, just the walking hand. I don't know why that just popped in my head. So it wasn't like just a disembodied hand. They could only just see that hand. So whatever was going on with the spirit realm breaking into the physical, manifesting itself, they were only able to see and witness the hand, wrist area part. Anyway, it's not that important. But this is what happens. This hand shows up and it starts writing on the wall. So I don't know if it had a writing instrument or if it was just using its finger. I think it says like it was writing with its fingers. So it writes all this stuff, and at first it doesn't tell us what it was writing, but whatever it wrote, it was very disturbing. So I find this interesting. Now, it would be surprising if something like that happened. And so, question for you, have you ever witnessed something in your life that has been like a total breaking through of something in the spirit realm into the physical, where it wasn't like you had this vision of something, but like literally something came through? Have you ever had that? So let me know. Love to hear about it. So this thing was breaking through. That would be alarming. It would be surprising. But what it talks about with Belshazzar is it like deeply troubled him, kind of like the dream did with King Nebuchadnezzar. So it's just interesting to consider that whatever it wrote, he didn't understand what it wrote. So it wasn't like he was reading the message and it was a disturbing message, though we find out later that it is. But the spiritual atmosphere, if you will, whatever was being imparted in this encounter time, it just deeply disturbed him and it bothered Belshazzar. So he, just like his grandfather, called all the magicians, the astrologers, it says the Chaldeans. It was just a group of mystic people, not the same way we would use the term Chaldeans now. But yes, so he gathered them all, and just like his grandfather was like, interpret this dream for me, and he gathered all the people. So he gathers them, and none of them are able to interpret it. They don't know what it means. It was probably just not in their language, and they didn't know what it was saying, and they didn't have the revelation to communicate. Which we see later that there was more to just what was written that needed to be communicated. So that's kind of the setup of what's happening. There's this whole breakthrough from the spirit into the physical, a writing on the wall. That's where we get that term, they read the writing on the wall. So then the queen, so she's not a part of the party, but she shows up, the queen, and she gives him this advice, and she says, your grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, had this man who basically talks him up. So I'm going to read that, verse 11, chapter 5, verse 11. So I just feel like this description of Daniel is very powerful, and then this is kind of what I want to press into to talk about. So verse 11, this is the queen talking to the king, saying, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom. Meaning this is what Daniel carried. This is his reputation. So like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king. So it says father, but then in other spots it clarifies in like the notes that it's actually grandfather. They're just using the word father. The king, I say your father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Then it goes on a little bit more, but we don't need to read the rest of that part. So Daniel had the position and the reputation as the master of the magicians, the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So this guy was considered, Daniel was considered like the top guy. Like this was the one you wanted. So Belshazzar was just not familiar with him yet, I guess. I don't know. We don't really understand that situation. Maybe he just didn't value, he probably didn't value those people the way his grandfather did, where he was constantly pulling on them for stuff. So he has this reputation. So then the question I would ask, because this is something that I'm personally hungry for, not to literally have those titles, master magician, that would be kind of cool, I guess. But the idea of it, like to have this reputation that like he has the spirit of the gods living in him. Now for us, we're not interested in being known for other gods. So of course we're interested in King Jesus and his reputation. But like, what would it be like for us as Christians to walk in such wisdom, revelation, and authority that we actually had the reputation. So individuals, I don't mean just Christians as a whole, though that would be cool too eventually if just Christians themselves had this reputation. That we actually had the reputation of like that we walk with the wisdom, light, understanding, and revelation of the Spirit of God. And, you know, other people with other understandings might use different terms, like this queen does here, the spirit of the gods, which of course we know Daniel didn't walk with other gods. He was loyal and devoted to Yahweh. So I just think that's interesting. That's the question I want to ask, is like, how do we get such a reputation? Like, how do we get there? Now, he had a very unique position where he was literally like a top level dude, advising and giving like the spiritual stuff going on to the king of an empire. So most of us, anyone watching this, probably do not have that kind of position, and it's probably never going to happen. I don't mean that in a mean way. If you have a dream and a call on your life for that, I'm not speaking against that. I'm just saying most of us, like myself, I don't believe I have a call on my life to like advise and be a part of leaders of nations. That's not on me. So if that's on you, bless you. I don't mean that in a bad way. But most of us, this is not the kind of position we're going to have. So the question is, like, how do we connect with this idea of a reputation of someone who walks the way Daniel walked and was known even as the master of magicians? Because, you know, there's a whole world, and maybe we'll talk about some of this in the future. There's a whole world around us that is very full of things of like the hidden knowledge, the different practices, esoteric things. You know, I could just list a bunch of stuff, psychic things, the new age world of different beliefs and practices and that religion. There's all kinds of stuff out there of people practicing real stuff. And should not we be the best at any of those things? Of course, not the things that are specifically prohibited by scripture, like sorcery, necromancy, stuff like that, and fortune telling. But there is the authentic version of those things in the kingdom. And so should not we have that reputation that we can operate in this at a higher level with greater power and authority than anyone else as Christians? So that's like my desire and my pursuit. Like, I want to be known for this. I want to be the master magician. Daniel gives a word. So this is what happens. Daniel shows up, and I think this is powerful. The question would be like, how do we grow in authority? How do we grow in our ability to be bold and communicate things that need to be communicated? So Daniel shows up. He doesn't have favor with Belshazzar. Like, if it was King Nebuchadnezzar, it's still a big deal, but Nebuchadnezzar knew him better. This guy did not know him. This king did not really know Daniel. And he shows up and he says, like, tell me the interpretation if you can. And if you do, he basically says, I'll make you the third ruler of the kingdom, and promote him, basically. He gets promoted if he can do it. So Daniel says, keep all your stuff. I don't want it. He ends up getting it anyway, but his point wasn't for the reward. So humility. And he starts off with, if you really read into it, he's not even interpreting what was written on the wall. He had this inner revelation by the Spirit of God of what needed to be said. And he goes on and explains what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar in the previous chapter, where he basically became like a beast for a number of years and lost his throne until he was restored once he was humbled. God humbled him, and he recognized, because he was exalting himself and he was so prideful, that God was reminding him where his power and glory came from. So Nebuchadnezzar ends up getting it right. We know this. But this guy, Belshazzar, did not get it, and he was going right back. And we see that even with how he was treating the holy instruments from and the vessels from the temple, God's temple. Right. So Daniel addresses this, and he's basically calling him out. So imagine being Daniel, If you want to go on an imaginative exercise, read chapter 5 and put yourself in the place of Daniel and just like see what's happening. Imagine standing before the king and this guy that doesn't know you, you don't have favor with him, and you boldly, like, he basically rebukes him. he says, like, you have not humbled yourself. Like, you don't remember whose glory essentially it really is, which is God's. And he's like, because of this, you're like King Nebuchadnezzar with all the stuff that happened. And it's this full-on rebuke. Like, he's bold. He just steps out. Then he begins to interpret it, what the writing was. So I want to bring that up a little. Don't need to go into the words that are used, but he calls them out for not glorifying God. And then in verse 26, he says this is the interpretation. So imagine being asked by someone of a high level of power to interpret something and to explain it. And without hesitation, Daniel goes, this is the interpretation of the thing. And honestly, this is also kind of cool. Just imagine God, like Daniel's speaking for God here. This is like one of the biggest, like, call out, like, get ready to fight, not really fight, but like, God's like talking like hardcore stuff right here. Like, he's just showing up, and I don't know how else to word it. Like, it's not like a burn, but this is just like God's like authority showing up. So the interpretation of the thing is this. First part is God has numbered your kingdom, so he's counted it and finished it. So he's numbered your kingdom and finished it. Like, that's heavy. Second part, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting, and are found wanting. So God says you are weighed in the balances and you're found wanting. And then the last part is your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So immediately he's telling them, like, God has finished your kingdom. He's measured you. You don't measure up. And you're about to lose your whole kingdom and divide it among the other kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. And so the response that the king has, he's true to his word. He rewards Daniel. But imagine being brought before a king and having to give such a hard word. Like, this wasn't a level of encouragement, and that's not permission for you to go up to leaders and give them harsh words, because that's a whole different thing. You get into prophets, and prophets versus prophecy, totally different thing. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about that in the future. So Daniel has to give this hard word, and I just admire that so much. He did that with King Nebuchadnezzar, and there was, kind of some trembling and stuff going on with that. It wasn't an easy thing. But God shows up here, writes on the wall, and is just telling him, like, you're done, and you don't measure up. I'm cutting this off. It's being broken. And this is all really in response quite immediately after Daniel confronting him, where not only does he talk about his haughtiness and like his pride, just like King Nebuchadnezzar had, but then he says, like, he even draws attention to the fact that he was using the holy instruments from God's temple, and somehow that was a part of it. And then they ended up worshiping what they were calling the gods of gold, silver, iron, clay, all this stuff. So I just think it's interesting also that there's some sort of spiritual correlation to, like, these were consecrated things for God's purposes. These were holy, set apart. And so other people were using these things improperly, and there was actually accountability on that. So obviously we live in a different time. Things are a little different, but consider the fact that, like, he has made you holy, and it is not a light thing that you would allow yourself, and I don't mean in like a physical sense necessarily, though that can be what I'm talking about. That applies. That, like, we would allow other things to use or give our bodies, soul, body, our whole being to something that is not of God. Just an interesting side note. God doesn't take that lightly. Not in a punishing, don't get weird with that sense, but we do live in a different covenant. But, like, these things still matter. So Daniel had such humility and integrity that he didn't water down the word. that God was speaking in that moment. He didn't back down at all. It was actually one of those moments, kind of like when David was facing Goliath and he like talked smack to Goliath and was basically, I'm going to cut off your head. And like you kind of get like one of those woo moments, you know. To me, this was the same thing. God's like, he's measured you and you're found wanting. This is the God creator of the universe calling him out on that. So Daniel had such humility and integrity. He delivers absolutely devastating news to the king. What he said came to pass immediately, basically. And it all happened. It came true. And so next week, that's just kind of leading into what I want to talk about next, is how do we grow in this kind of thing? Obviously, this is a very specific situation that none of us are going to be in that kind of situation just like that, of course. But we each have roles in life and people we have influence in. And so the question is, how can we, and can we, and if we can, how? I'll just repeat the question a bunch of times. Grow in favor with people, influence, and authority, and being able to give God's messages when they're needed to give, whether words of encouragement or at times words of correction when it's appropriately applied. And so we'll talk about that. And anyway, yeah, so that's the end of this part of Daniel chapter 5. We will talk further next week, touching on some of those very things. And anyways, thank you for joining me. I will see you next week.